Imagine being handed a real estate empire worth millions before you even learned how to ride a bike. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, for Donald Trump, this wasn't just a fantasy, it was his reality. For decades, Trump has masterfully crafted the image of a self made billionaire, a man who took a modest $1 million loan from his father and turned it into a vast fortune. But as we're about to uncover, the road to his billions was paved long before he even stepped into a boardroom. Buckle up, because this journey is filled with clever financial maneuvers, tax loopholes, and more money transfers than a shady offshore bank. The empire begins. Fred Trump's rise to wealth. Long before the golden letters of Trump adorned skyscrapers and casinos, there was Fred Trump, a man who understood the real estate game better than most. Having lost his father at just 12 years old, Fred wasn't about to let life dictate his fate. By the age of 20, he had already built his first residential house, and he had chosen the perfect time to dive into real estate. The 1930s saw America rolling out the New Deal, a series of government programs designed to boost the economy, including residential construction. The U.S. government, eager to increase homeownership, handed out cheap loans and subsidies like candy on Halloween. Fred, a sharp businessman, capitalized on this golden opportunity, securing government-backed funding to develop affordable housing. Over the next few decades, the country introduced even more housing programs, from military housing incentives during World War II to post-war housing booms driven by the GI Bill. And guess who was always at the front of the line with his hands out? Fred Trump. By the time the 1950s rolled around, Fred wasn't just successful, he was a real estate mogul sitting atop a government-funded fortune. In 1949 alone, the Federal Housing Administration handed him a $26 million loan to construct two massive apartment complexes in Brooklyn. To put that into perspective, $26 million back then is the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. But here's the kicker: Fred wasn't just building wealth for himself, he was already setting up his children, particularly young Donald, for financial dominance. How Donald Trump became a millionaire at 3 years old. Most toddlers are just learning to string sentences together at the age of 3. Meanwhile, little Donald Trump was already the beneficiary of a trust fund that was bringing in tens of thousands of dollars a year. Thanks, Dad. Fred had a genius way of passing down wealth without raising too many eyebrows. Before building those Brooklyn apartment complexes, he first purchased the land under his company's name. Then he set up a trust where his children, including Donald, were the beneficiaries. He transferred the land into this trust, and his company had to lease it back under a ground lease agreement. Translation: Donald and his siblings, before they even understood what a mortgage was, were raking in $60,000 a year, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands today, just for existing. But this was just the start. Over the years, Fred continued this financial magic trick, transferring properties to his children without triggering hefty taxes. He'd construct buildings using government money, then give shares of those buildings to Donald and his siblings. The only issue: the IRS probably wouldn't have been too thrilled. Fred didn't exactly pay the required gift taxes on most of these transactions, and New York's tax authorities had him in their sights for decades. The Trump name rises, courtesy of Dad's wallet. By the time Donald Trump graduated college in 1968, he didn't have to build a name for himself, his father had already done it for him. But that didn't stop Fred from making sure his son had an even bigger head start. In 1972, Fred and Donald teamed up for a new project, an $8 million apartment complex. Guess who did most of the work? Fred. And guess who pocketed most of the profits? Donald. Donald wasn't just earning a share of the partnership profits, he was also receiving hefty consulting and management fees. Even air conditioner rental fees from tenants somehow ended up in his pockets. By 1975, at just 29 years old, Donald was pulling in over $300,000 per year from this setup, and by the end of the decade, he had accumulated around $9 million from his father's various businesses. To build his public image, Fred even orchestrated media coverage portraying Donald as a young self-made millionaire worth $200 million. Of course, that number was about as accurate as a fish claiming it can fly. The real mastermind behind the projects: Fred Trump, who continued bankrolling Donald's ventures under the guise of loans. The loans that were never repaid. When Donald set his sights on Manhattan real estate in the late 1970s, he needed capital, and who better to ask than Dad? Fred handed him millions in what were technically loans, except these loans had a little twist. They were structured with an interest rate, but the interest was paid back up front. There was no repayment schedule, meaning Donald could keep the money indefinitely. In simpler terms, these were loans in name only Donald wasn't expected to repay them, and Fred had no intention of asking. It was a clever way to transfer wealth without drawing too much attention. When Donald took on his first big Manhattan project, transforming the Commodore Hotel into the Grand Hyatt, it was Fred's money again that made it happen. And when Trump Tower began construction in the 1980s, surprise Fred's money came to the rescue once more. The financial lifeline from his father wasn't just about helping a son. It was about building an empire under the Trump name, ensuring the family's influence would extend for generations. Saving Trump's casinos from collapse, the Fred Trump lifeline. By the late 1980s, Donald Trump had plunged into risky ventures like Trump Airlines, the Plaza Hotel, and a series of Atlantic City casinos. These projects, driven by aggressive borrowing and grand ambitions, quickly turned into financial disasters. The casinos, in particular, hemorrhaged money, leaving Donald drowning in debt by the early 1990s. As bankruptcy loomed, his father, Fred Trump, stepped in with a financial lifeline. One of the most creative and legally questionable bailouts involved Fred purchasing $3.35 million in casino chips at Trump Castle without placing a single bet. This maneuver injected much-needed cash into Donald's struggling empire, delaying an imminent default. But that wasn't the only trick up Fred's sleeve. He frequently bought stakes in Donald's failing properties at inflated prices, later selling them back at steep losses. This allowed millions to flow into Donald's businesses while keeping the transactions under the radar. Though these bailouts temporarily kept Donald afloat, they couldn't reverse his financial missteps. By the early 1990s, his empire collapsed under crushing debt, leading to multiple bankruptcies. Without Fred's deep pockets and strategic interventions, the downfall would have been swifter and far more catastrophic. The Trump empire sold off. By the 1990s, Fred's health was failing, and with it came the rush to transfer what was left of his fortune to his children before estate taxes could take a bite. Donald and his siblings took over management of Fred's buildings, inflating maintenance costs to move millions into their own pockets. But when the time came to formally inherit the empire, they faced one crucial challenge: lowering the taxable value of Fred's holdings. Enter a shady real estate appraiser who, through some mind-boggling calculations, managed to make 25 apartment complexes with 7,000 units worth just $40 million on paper. By the time Fred passed in 1999, his bank account held just $2 million, despite his empire being worth far more. Then in 2004, Donald and his siblings sold off everything for $700 million, officially closing the chapter on Fred Trump's real estate legacy. And that, my friends, is the untold truth behind Trump's billions, proving once again that being born into wealth is the ultimate cheat code. If you enjoyed this deep dive into money, power, and some questionable tax tactics, don't just sit there. Hit that like button. And if you love juicy stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out. After all, why work hard when you can let YouTube do the thinking for you? See you in the next one.